We've talked so much about what your knowledge was going into that first session and how much you maybe weren't as affected by a lot of other people of the stigma of it. So it took you 10, 15 years, even given that, getting in. What do you think, if anything, would have gotten you in the door sooner? Is there anything anyone could have said or done, or anything you could have said or done that would have gotten you there?
This one's not hard to answer. It gets convoluted, and I guess I'll explain. So this actually is a good tie-in to things you were saying, Tanya. What gave me my awareness is that, again, I have at least, okay, so long story short, I lived alone with my mother. I'm a child of divorce. My dad is an absolutely fantastic person. My mother is the complete polar opposite of that. Okay. Like no one wants to be around her at this point in time. It's like that level, like the entire family. My dad gave up a lot to ensure that the court would allow me, like, a very small amount of time to see him so he wasn't totally kicked out of my life. And he made it his mission, knowing what I was living in, right? And he, again, this wasn't like your dad should have tried harder. Like 3 child psychologists told the judge not to give me to my mother, but it was the 80s. Okay. I mean, I've literally watched a CPS agent be laughed in the face by my mother in my own living room, right? After she kicked me out of our house when I was in grade 7. Okay. For not wanting to go to Air Cadets anymore. That was the catalyst. So my dad made it his mission, knowing all that he was going to be almost polar opposite, right? Like for good and for bad. Maybe I could have had a little bit better structure out of my dad, right? The positive, like teaching as a structure, but whatever. I don't fault him for any of that stuff. The work him and my stepmom sort of enabled me to be aware of this stuff. It was always a safe place to describe what was going on. So here's the problem with that, though. So I've got this logical brain. I've got this great awareness of what's going on. For my 20s, especially my 20s, okay, all the way, like literally that entire decade, I thought because I knew so much and was on top of it that I was on top of it, right? And we go back to that statement of like, good old Mike Tyson, like everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. That's exactly how my life went for 10 years. There was these periods of complete ignorance where I felt like I was being fine. And the only reason fine was a term was because I was being ignorant to the symptoms I was displaying. And I would only become aware of that when I got punched in the face by something. And then it was a crisis. And so we ask the question, like, what could have anybody said to you, Rob, at that decade? Nothing. Literally nothing. Right? Because I was going through this pattern. Now, what could I do for myself? Well, that's the tragic part. Sometimes you got to get punched in the face hard enough in the most obvious way for you to realize that you've been playing yourself for a fool, right? So I literally had a soundtrack in my head. I went to university at 19 because I was one. Back in those days, we left high school at 19 because we had OAC in Ontario. And so I went to Western in Ontario, did not complete because here's the thing. I left home being like, I'm free, right? And my years at Western, I played out my tragedy. So first year, I almost flunked out. And here I am, like I'm an extremely intelligent person, and I got to go back to Western for my second year because of 0.5%. I had to meet with an academic counselor, blah, 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 all that. So a bunch of failings at the start of my 20s that started to make my life a little bit rocky. That sets a pattern. Just so happens, I dated, I look back and I joke about like how she ever stuck with me for this long, but I dated a young lady for 6 years in my 20s. We lived together the entire time. She was phenomenal, except she was the participant on this ride called Rob's Fine, Don't Whatever, right? And like I was a cyclical mess to the point where it ended as tragically as one could write in a movie. I should explain that. I just mean in the sense of like it sounds movie-like, okay? So she went away on a trip. She's a dual citizen, Scotland and Canada, and she went on a trip to visit Scotland. That's where her mom was born. And didn't I get a Dear John email? I remember it was a Tuesday. It was 8 in the morning. I was going to my really shitty telemarketing job because that's all I was worth at that point in time. And it was hey, I'm never coming home. And what do you do with that? It hit me so friggin' hard that number one, the epiphany didn't come right away. Okay, it hit me so hard, it sent me into a reactive depression for nearly 4 years after that, and even more so when I almost stayed like I pretty much was single for 7 years after that. Now I had a bunch of excuses of why, and that's similarly so why the epiphany didn't come. So I spent 4 years, probably took me 4 of that 7 years to start becoming honest about the situation. I spent 4 years being like, how could someone do me so wrong? But that was the beginning of it. That was this thing that obviously I took for granted, right? Because I'm playing through my own bullshit. And then this thing's gone. You didn't realize how huge it was. And it broke me. It literally erased. Like there was a couple layers in that, right? Like, we started dating when I was like 22, 23 kind of deal. Broke up just before I was 30. Like, who am I, right? Like, I'm already a troubled kid coming out of high school, going into university. No idea of self-identity because I didn't have one as a kid, right? I was this pliable thing that just tried to fit in. And then I became a couple for a really long time, right? So, it was a very frightening world for me. And the epiphany finally hit me. That punch was so hard, even though it took me years to realize that it was just another human being doing what they needed to do and how they knew how to survive, which is they couldn't let me go without completely being on the other side of the world to do it. And it was my fault, right? Like I had to take ownership of what I put this person through. Like I was exactly what my mother put me through. Like my mother never wound up and clocked me in the face. Similarly so, I would never hit a female, but I was so emotionally and intellectually manipulative. And I just thought, at the time doing it was just lovers' quarrels, but it wasn't. It was a game that I didn't even know I was playing. And frankly, it took that situation to understand I'd already done it to another person at the tail end of high school. And again, that entire situation, until that point, I'd always looked back at going, oh, this person did me wrong. Oh, they dumped me right before we went to the same university and are living in the same dorm. That's all I could see because I had put a record on the player, leaving my home at 19, going, I'm free, that means I'm better, without understanding the ramifications.
For me, similar thing in terms of I left a pretty rough home life and went to art school. It's fixed. I'm free. I'm free of that place. However, that programming has been ingrained in me, and I would repeat cycles of behavior that I had learned as a young woman, as a child. And I'm not a therapist, but it sounds like there's very similar instances where in relating to people and having repeated these cycles and eventually having an opportunity to take ownership of said cycle, that's what you needed in order to go to therapy. I might be off base, but for me, it wasn't actually that someone had left. It was actually that someone had arrived in my life where I had toxic boyfriends and just not great experiences in relationships. But then someone came along where they were just this wonderful, safe, soft landing, and they were patient and kind and gentle. And I felt myself entering the cycle where I wasn't manipulative, but I became terrified because of the abuse I endured as a kid. I was waiting for the honeymoon period to drop and just became extremely reactive and extremely frightened. And it was recognizing that cycle was starting and then deciding to take ownership of, we're not doing this again. That's when I went to therapy because I was terrified of being in the same room as this person that I was very affectionate towards just months prior. But once it got to a certain point, it got real. I went, I can't do this. And through recognizing I was doing that loop again, that's when I went, oh, I need to talk to somebody. And that was one of the reasons I landed on the therapist couch. Before I spewed emotionally to Catherine, my first thing was, I'm scared to be in this room with my partner and they haven't done anything. And I want to, the problematic phrase is, I want to fix myself. I want to just not be broken in this regard, was what I said, something like that. But I find that is a common thing, is where there's at least immediate feedback that something has happened. There's an event and you go, oh shit, it's happening again. And I don't want it to happen again, or this, I need to learn the skills to just break out of that cycle. So I guess that's just my offering on my take on.
Well, actually what you say there is for me, it hits home. So I guess I'll back explain this. So, I had started this saying, the thing that spawned me to go to therapy in the first place was this realization on the first year anniversary of my brother's death, I was really messed up, right? I guess what feeds into that, right? Like, so, I'm very, it's probably, again, the punch in the face sort of thing that my way, my personality, my brain, like, it held that punch in the face as an emotional milestone, right? Or a guide, like a mile guide or whatever, a mark in the ground to tell me how far I've traveled. And it's those things that my brain never truly forgot. So, like, again, like, it took me the first 4 years, right, of this breakup to finally start to consider that, oh, I can't be blaming this other person for this thing. And it was actually, this other thing. It was the me part of it, right? And I said that I stayed, like, as a reaction, okay? I stayed pretty much single for like 7 years, okay? Now, here's the kind of crazy thing. So, to tie all this together back to my intro, just so everybody understands, right? Like, I spent a big portion of my 30s doing fake action guy cool stuff, like riding in helicopters and whatever, all for pretend and LARPing. But I found an identity in that, right? Like, again, a part of that was I didn't mean to do it. I just used to paintball as a kid. So I was trying to find new hobbies and stuff, right? I'd finally gotten a grown-up job at friggin' 30. I was accomplishing things that allowed me to make those moves. So I looked at that 7 years of living like a friggin' monk as like, oh, Rob's discovering himself. This is self-improvement time, which technically, yes, it was, right? Like, I was achieving things. It took me 7+ years to realize it was actually because I was terrified of who I was. And I didn't want to subject somebody. Like, I lived, again, pretty much in a decade thinking, Rob's fine. I'm not destroying another person's emotional baseline, right? So 7 years later, I come to realize or hold this emotional fact in my head that I actually was just running scared because I didn't know what I would be, right? Because here it was, this eye-awakening sort of event. This person, Dear John, lettering me, well, email, because there's the modern times. I'd thought that I had everything under control until that moment. I now no longer knew what I didn't know. And it terrified me, right? It terrified me who I was because I thought I wasn't. And I didn't want to take the chance anymore. So the whole thing with my brother's anniversary, I had spent the last year thinking I had it under control. And boop, not the case, Rob. And that terrified me. And it terrified me enough having these emotional mile markers in my past of where I've fooled myself, right? Where I've taken the comfortable path of, oh, I woke up today, it's a Tuesday, and I don't feel as shitty as I did yesterday, so I must be okay, and I can wait a little bit longer. That kind of came to an end. Like, it was it almost, to try to pretend it was any different, almost started to feel as bad as realizing the terrible things I'd done.
At least for me, this was my experience. When you grow up in a home that requires you to not be yourself in order to stay safe, it is very difficult when you leave the house to first, I think the first stage of it is what you talked about, is the house doesn't actually leave you. And the things that you had to do and who you had to be to stay safe in that home transfer into a different house that is now no longer helpful and is actually harmful. And so I think that's the first stage generally, is like when you reach that realization of, oh no, I have become all of the things that I was scared of. And then you get to the bridge of, well, I am responding as though I'm still in this house. And that's why I'm acting this way. It's not, oh, you're inherently a terrible person who's purposely manipulating and harming people. It's, I never learned how to emotionally take myself out of that home. And then the second stage that happens a lot is, okay, well, if I'm carrying that home around, I can't make anyone else come into it. I have to separate myself, isolate myself. It is the only way. I'm the problem. I need to protect everyone else.
Yeah, and that's what my mid-20s became, right? Like, so at the time, it looked like anger. Still, at times, looks like anger, and I'll explain that in a minute. I was aware enough to realize at that moment where I decided like I need to separate myself or isolate myself for the protection of others, was because I knew it wasn't necessarily that I'd become my mother. I was far too caring and far too intelligent and all these other side of the things that just my mother is not, right? Inarguably, I've come to realize that, these little people inside me, that's the weirdest way to say that. Sorry, I just killed myself now.
We're keeping that one in.
Yeah, please do. Like the little, like the younger versions of me that got trapped, that never grew up with the physical body of me, right? Like the people that are still trapped in that house as you sort of pertain to it, they're still trying to figure out what I went through. They try to understand it on an adult level, and that's that sort of weirdness about psychology, is that we've got these little pieces of us that truly don't understand what even my waking life understands, right? It's not based in logic or what you know. So, when I would do the same behavioral patterns or display the same behavioral patterns that I went through as a kid, was not me taking those things and becoming that. It was what I understand my subconscious was presenting a situation in which would allow that little subconscious part of me try to figure out where the situation was coming from, when as a kid on the receiving end had no fucking clue what was going on. Now, that sounds great on paper, except then you have to also realize that if it was destroying me as a child, what's it doing to someone that just wants to love you? So it took a long time for me to sort of look at it differently that way. And, I'm going to touch on something to complete this thought, touch on something we talked about a long time ago at this point in time. Those aha moments, right? So for a long time, I viewed the behavior set of my mother, and thus the symptomatic sort of behaviors that I would display, as purely just anger. And it's weird when you start to break apart where emotions can come from. And this was actually a quintessential part of the aha moment. So with the help of my therapist, and funny enough, I was dog sitting for a buddy for the last 3 weeks to a month kind of deal. And the dog was teaching me something. So the dog was a little bit reactive on the leash with some dogs, often when they were across the street. And that's a common thing in the dog world, like on leash reactivity. Okay. And obviously when we look at a dog reacting, it looks aggressive. That's a defense mechanism of the dog. They'll stamp their feet, they'll false charge, they'll bark, obviously, right? Particularly aggressive dog, then it might do things like bare teeth, snap. If you're not trained with the behavior, most people will pick up their toddlers at that point in time. But in watching this dog, I realized the dog wasn't angry. And the moment I realized that the dog wasn't angry, Rob sort of realized that Rob wasn't angry. What Rob was terrified. I looked back on things that behavior set. It could be a minor change to an expected plan. It could be something somebody said that I wasn't expecting. But the bottom line was, a trigger of that was surprise, because I had lived a life where I had to forecast with 100% accuracy everything before it hit me. And the moment something changed was not just an annoyance, was a possible threat to my survival, no matter how big or how small. And it wasn't until I realized that, hey, here I am playing out this drama, just playing the antagonist rather than the protagonist on the receiving end, and realizing that it's actually not anger, it's fear that's driving this, that I'm creating situations that in the end, as interestingly quizzical as the human psychology is, here I am afraid of losing somebody and creating situations that only guarantees that I lose them, to try to play out some drama from my when I was 3, recreating the same environment, except I'm the one creating it this time.
I actually had a session with Catherine recently where I was engaging in hypercritical, hyper-analytical, perfectionist behaviors, and she does a lot of inner parts work, which from what I have gleaned from your story, your therapist does as well. And she was asking me really interesting things, such as she runs the gamut where it goes, what do you think the child needs in order to feel safe? And we went down that line of conversation, and I realized that, oh, she's screaming at everyone to get away from her because she doesn't want anyone to see how terrified and how stuck. She's essentially in quicksand, but instead of screaming for help, because help historically came at a cost of my bodily autonomy or self-esteem. I don't want help. I want you to get away from me. And so this inner child is screaming at everything and trying to mask the fact that she's terrified and that she feels stuck. She doesn't know how to get out, and she doesn't trust this person or people enough to help her with that. And Olivia can speak much more to that, but the parts works is really fascinating, especially when Catherine started asking me, how old does she think you are and how old do you think she is? Because it's a really interesting exercise to, I don't know if it's to triangulate the age in which the trauma happened. Olivia, again, can explain what that is about, because I'm not entirely sure what that question means, but I would love to hear more about it.
It's funny you say this. Sorry, I don't know if I'm jumping in on you here, Olivia.
You're the guest, dude. It's all good.
So it's funny that you mention all that. And I can't tell you if it's accurate to the triangulation statement. But what I can tell you is a common thread in my life of awareness. I have always, still right now, I do not feel like a 40-year-old. I tell you, like I still walk through my life almost like 20 years behind. In terms, not in terms of like what I do and whatnot, but quite literally how I feel on the inside. I don't feel like a 40-year-old. And I don't mean it on the superficial level, like, hey, I work out and all that sort of stuff so it keeps me young. I literally mean like I just don't see my world in the same way. Now that's for good and for bad though. And like that's something I've always struggled with. It's only recently that I've really come to terms with like I'm missing a big part of my life. Like my friends are all 20 years ahead of me. And it's really hard to explain to people why that is. I don't own my own home. Just in the last like 5 years figured out like saving money is a good thing. I almost lived like a fatalism based life before. Like I couldn't imagine a future. Like I literally almost like I was living like I was an 18-year-old where like nothing else matters because life doesn't exist yet, right? So while all my friends have kids and all that sort of stuff, I was spending 20 years not being like trying not to be a total mess. So yeah, like in my head, like I still don't feel like what I assume my father, who had me by the time he was 35, his own home, a long career, all these sort of things, like I don't think I feel, I can tell you I don't. I just don't look at the world the same way. And I can tell you I don't feel like a 3-year-old. And the start of my journey is literally from about toddler age. That's kind of a fun fact about the person that is my mother. As long as you can't talk back, she loves you. But around 2 or 3, things get problematic.
Both of you are hitting on things that are really common with childhood trauma that you don't get to emotionally age properly. Because as a kid, you're supposed to be learning how to interact with the world and viewing it as safe. And then once the world is safe, then you can go out and explore and figure out who you are and what you feel like and what it's like to fail in a way that is still kind of protected, like having the bumpers up. And when you grow up in a traumatic household, you don't get any of that. You skip all of those things. And then you're playing catch up of, well, who am I? Like you said, you're trying to figure that out in your 30s of like, oh shit, I don't have a personality or an identity outside of my life sucked and I don't know what to do. And that same thing of like not thinking about saving money or owning a home or whatever, because a lot of times growing up in those homes, you physically can't imagine a future that feels safe or at all, right? It's like, well, I'm stuck. I'm stuck in this. I'm never going to get out of this. So the future is not my main concern. I'm just trying to stay alive every day. So that just generally, and then I think in terms of like the specifics of when you're doing that parts work of why it's helpful to ask that question of like, how old do you feel these parts to be and how old do they think you are and vice versa? And I think a lot of times those younger parts of ourselves are the ones in the driver's seat. And that's why we don't feel our age, because there's a 16-year-old version of us that got really good at surviving the household, even though they weren't doing very well. They knew at that point how to make it so that mom or dad is the least harmful they can possibly be. Right? Like you said, I can predict the energy in the room, one step, one breath, one word. And that version of us is not going to let those younger, exiled, vulnerable parts of ourselves show up because it was not safe for them then. So I think it's really helpful to know what age it feels like those parts are, because you can kind of then pinpoint like, all right, where did things shift? When did I put up that wall of I'm not letting anyone else in? And then on the other hand, like, do they view you as a competent adult? Do those parts of yourself even recognize that you're separate from them? Or do you think you're just another kid stuck in the house? right? Because they're not going to trust you. They're also probably not going to trust you if they view you as an adult because, as we all know, when you grow up in those households, adults are not safe. Being able to work through that process of like, do those parts of yourselves really view you as an adult? And if so, how can we make it so that they trust you to make the decisions so that they can still be in the car, they can still be in the passenger seat, but you have to be the one to drive. And I think a lot of times, truthfully, people who've had that trauma are more connected to their inner child once they've done the work in terms of not giving up hobbies and like really being able to still enjoy the playfulness of life and not just focusing on saving money, buying a house, having kids, right? Like I think there is on some level a really cool part that comes out of it. Wouldn't necessarily say it's worth it having to grow up like that, but it is something that I think plays a role that you are more connected to those parts of yourself. But until you do the work, sometimes it feels like they're running the show and you're like, well, I don't want to do anything responsible or I can't even think about it because it feels like there's a 16-year-old driving the car.
Speaking to the trust portion, I mean that's where we're currently at with my stuff, right? It hits home with what you said there, Olivia. I'm just sort of starting to come to grips with the fact that the reason why this stuff is on autopilot for me is because the two different sides to that traumatic kid, right? So there's the one that, based on my personality, I want to succeed, I want to be better than things or whatnot, but I also have another side that says, well, that'll probably just end up in terrible, terrible, terrible pain. Right. So I've got this manager that's screaming at me for being a lazy POS because I'm too afraid to go do something. But I got this little kid also screaming that everyone's going to hate you and you're going to fail and all this sort of stuff. And they don't do anything. Like that autopilot nature of it is because probably or what I understand it is like those little kids or those little voices in me don't understand what I've done since. Because they're living in their own compartmentalized world. Like, again, I've achieved. I am a confident person. I know I've got value. All those conscious, logical things that I understand now they have no connection to. So they just don't trust that I'll be okay. So they still continue to scream at me from my subconscious. Or really, I think this is really important for listeners, beginners in this journey, right? Like when I say that I've got these autopilots that scream at me, realize that it's not a conversation. The symptom is the physiological reaction to the screams, right? Like, so it feels like it's you doing it, right? And I think that goes back to what you said about who's really in the driver's seat and how muddy that can get, right? In certain situations, Rob goes away. The Rob you guys know is not there, even though he is. And I don't even realize that I'm not there anymore. And that's the really mindfuckery part of it. Because I'm still present. I still ride the ride, but I've got no control over it at that moment in time. And it doesn't get any better until you can start bridging those places, I feel. I mean, again, I'm still on that new to this journey, so I'm mostly like, yeah, I have faith it'll work out, but it's stuff I'd never looked at before, right? Yeah. And actually, Tanya, sorry, I wanted to touch on, and I can't remember how you led into this, but I guess I'll just explain my side. A big part of what kept me from getting help in the end, or for again, I'm 40. So what happened to the last decade, Rob? You got smacked in the face, you started having these epiphanies in your 30s. Why 40? It's because it shifted. I got all these platforms, right? And I started to become somebody that people followed. And I think this is where it crosses over where I've got a pretty good understanding of how it is for my service-based friends, like people who are former or current in anything, law enforcement, military, is that I struggled against this idea that if I admit that I need help, are all these people going to think I'm weak? And who have they been following? And what do I want or don't want the effect on that perception to be? And it took me a long time to realize that, screw it, I need to do what I need to do. And if anything, I could use that to help people. But it took me a very long time to get over this idea that, if anybody saw the dark parts of me, that I would be actually less valuable. And it's almost like, ooh, I pulled the wool over everybody's eyes and now the mask's off kind of deal.
I don't have even a fraction of the following, but starting this podcast has been innovating because I've talked about my shit on Instagram stories, which disappear after 24 hours. I've talked about this shit in person, but having this recorded and just everyone hearing about the things I've gone through, it does leave you vulnerable. And I thankfully have managed to cultivate an attitude of, maybe it's Goggins-esque, but I like to think, I haven't read it, but very Red Sonja, and as to why she wears such a skimpy battle bikini thing of, I'm going to leave myself vulnerable, but good luck trying to get at me. And not in a self-defensive way, but I've learned so much. I've become a very multifaceted human being because of the things I've gone through. And I've done a lot of work in therapy where these aren't fresh wounds, these are scars. But it's very hard to poke those and harm me because I'm okay with this stuff that I've gone through. The fact that people even would send me messages or DMs talking about how they feel very much less alone because of the candor with which I speak about my experiences, that has provided me fuel. And I'm so thankful that you're doing that on your much larger platform. And then to jump back to the point where the inner parts work and building trust, that is a recent lesson I've been learning from Catherine. Well, she's been probably hammering it in me the whole time. But finally, my thick skull is starting to understand it, is that I have a tendency to overwork and burn out and then engage in binge shopping or what have you. And eventually through just session after session of me being very much like a soccer mom that's angry at her kid for screaming in the Walmart, I was initially that angry soccer mom just being frustrated at the other part of me for not behaving exactly the way I want. And eventually I came to the realization that, oh, kid's screaming in the Walmart because she's exhausted. You've been dragging her around all day from errand to errand, promising her that you'll take her to the park, but you never do. And she no longer trusts you. So she's disconnected from you. She's running off and going to the freezer section and eating all the ice cream she can find. She doesn't trust you because you haven't earned that trust. And this last while, it has been this journey of building that trust within myself. And it makes complete sense. It's accountability. I haven't demonstrated that I am an adult worthy of trust because of the track record that my inner children and I have had. I've screamed at them, I've physically exerted or beaten them into submission. It's been as fractured and as complicated a relationship as the one I have with my mom. And at first, Catherine had me start with journaling, which I was like, this is stupid. I didn't understand the point of it, but she had been strongly suggesting I do so. And journaling, initial things were either me emotion vomiting or just saying this is stupid. And eventually I started reading the things on there. So while I imagine there is a therapeutic benefit to just having these experiences externalized and not swirling around in your head, what I realized when I was reading is I'm actually really sweet of a person. And what was being written on the page was very different than the cassette player, I'm old, cassette tape that was playing in my head of what I made myself out to be, which was an asshole, a monster, so on and so forth, in order to keep myself safe. Through doing that work and building that communication, which was the first step to building trust, I started hearing essentially what those different parts had to say. And what started out as a inner newborn screaming started becoming an infant, a toddler, occasionally a teenager. But the fluency with which we speak to each other has gotten more and more sophisticated over the years. I can't say your journey is going to be the same, and maybe Olivia can speak to if that is a goal.
That's where I'm currently at in my journey. I guess that's the other way to describe this unknown of I don't know how it's supposed to feel. I don't know what this work feels or looks like particularly, right? So I'm still in the very beginning stages of again, I logically understand it, but I don't know what practicing looks like. I'm throwing punches in the dark, hoping something lands kind of deal, right? I always sort of turn away from the camera. I got a whiteboard just off frame there. And I put all my notes there, right? So I got my professional ones, my personal ones, take out the trash and all that sort of crap. And then I've got my little corner where I'm listing out all the stuff that we talked about in my last session, right? Hey, spend time with the manager part of that little kid. Cool. Do I call him? Do I send an email and set up an appointment? I don't know how any of this works, right? How do I spend time with the guy? I don't know yet. Is it an active goal in my head that I want to be able to have a really concise conversation, a Hemingway-like conversation with this inner child? I don't even know if that's the right way to say it, right? I'm that new to it, right? I obviously have some communication issues with some very significant parts of my past that I would love to understand and participate in. But what that looks like just yet, not that I don't understand it, I don't at the core of my subconscious understand what that feels like or looks like just yet.
That's so relatable. I remember that in the beginning for me, being a client, but also being a therapist. It's an interesting thing, but I think it's also helpful for people to know that therapists have just as much of a hard time with this stuff. Like exactly like we're talking about. Just because I logically know these things doesn't make it any easier for me to feel it in my body. So it is kind of, I think, a lifelong journey. But at least for me, in the experience of doing that parts work and having contact with the very wounded gutter children in my brain, is that they don't scream at me anymore when they need something. I can hear those voices in a much calmer way, and they're very, very clear about what they need from me, whether it's rest or play or connection. And I think that's the work that has been the most helpful for me as a client of having that reparenting experience of I can be the person that I needed as a kid, and I can create a home that is safe and that does allow for mistakes and that does allow every part of me to just be who I am. So I think that's something that, again, not like a logical and not necessarily a very cut and dry like treatment planned goal, but I think on that topic of the inner child stuff, that's the overarching end goal that has been really helpful for me.
That was brilliant. I think that'd be a really great place to end it. And Rob, if you have any closing remarks and if you want to point us to any resources or anything that your projects, whatever, your Tinder profile, whatever it is, if you want to point us to anything that may be of use for the listeners.
I guess I didn't come with homework prepared in terms of that stuff. What I would like to emphasize, right? Like, and I think this is, again, if the audience that we want to target with this particular talk is those sort of in my shoes, right? And understanding that for a lot of people, they don't even come from the beneficial foundation that I came from. So this needs to hit them a little bit harder, right? This is why I guess I'm making this statement. I think I've come to realize through a lot of opportunities, self-created for the most part, but it's finally hitting home. And I'm talking hitting home within like the last month and a half, is this idea that while I understand that there's something that drives me with this sense of an autopilot, right? We can talk about these inner children, these frozen in time traumatic pieces of our lives that tend to drive the car, so to speak, or carry the home with us on our backs or whatever. The thing that I think drives me these days is the very acute knowledge or acceptance that autopilot or not, all this fear of who I am and what that might become should I actually dive in to ask to get help, the things that keep us from doing this for ourselves, none of it is as scary or as terrifying or will end up being as horrific as doing absolutely nothing. And I did nothing for 20 years. And while I am not a regretful person, I can't fix that 20 years without a time machine. Nothing as scary as living with what you're terrified with. And anything is better than that. So, I mean, it's scary. It's scary sending an email. It's scary phoning somebody. It's scary meeting a stranger. It's scary opening up. It's scary coming on podcasts. It's scary living life. But if just living life is terrifying, anything is better. That is the faith that anyone going through this shit needs to understand, because it is better than the alternative. No, it's...
Oh, that was brilliant. And I think that's a good spot to end it. And don't worry, you end up reaching the end of therapy. You beat it. It gets super clear and easy. No.
No, there is no finality. That's, I guess, the good point to target, Tanya. I think you said it good, and that is, I am a lifelong work in progress. As so all should we be, positive or negative, but me especially. I am never not going to be like something.